You're listening to The Crunch with Cam Slater, right here on RCR, Reality Check Radio.
Casey Costello has been the spokesperson for Hobson's Pledge, a former ACT candidate and a board member of the New Conservatives. But now she has announced she is standing for New Zealand First in this election. She's on the line now. Welcome to The Crunch, Casey.
Thank you very much.
You had a little chat with Rodney the other day, and I just wanted to explore a few other angles about why you've decided to become a candidate for New Zealand First, and to look at some of the media coverage of you joining New Zealand First for this election campaign. But before I want to start, I read an article that you wrote in 2017, which you titled, "Written by a New Zealander of Maori ancestry, a winner in life and in business, and a true believer in truth and justice, Casey Costello." And there's something I didn't know about you, despite being a subscriber and a follower of Hobson's Pledge for a number of years, that you are actually of Maori ancestry. Are you the right kind of Maori?
I think if you ask Willie Jackson, I wouldn't be. I'd be classified as a useless Māori. But I think that's the part now. We've got down to the point it's not about your ancestry or your culture or your heritage or te reo, or it's whether you agree with the political construct. So
it's the right political tribe, really, rather than any iwi or hapu that you belong to.
Yeah. And I think that's evident by the fact that, Māori are a hapu iwi-centric people. That's how we identify, that's how we connect. Whānau, hapu, iwi is, and yet the current government is so determined to centralise and take away that identity. I don't know how they argue that they are representing Māori when everything they're doing is contrary to Māori culture.
I've got a friend who's a councillor in a council, a district council in the North Island, and he was talking to me about how co-governance with regards to 3 or 4 or 5 or 9 waters or whatever they're calling it now means for that council. He said there's something like 17 iwi and 57 hapu, and somehow they have to incorporate in this council all of those voices before they can even start to engage with everybody else. And he said it's just grinding the council processes to a halt. And he said when this water thing comes in, it's going to make it even worse. Are we heading down the wrong path here?
Absolutely.
In 100 miles an hour?
At breakneck speed, and we've just forgotten about outcomes. We're not even considering what's the best outcome, what's going to make things more efficient. We're so focused on this idea of representation. And I think people aren't understanding that co-governance, it's kind of pictured as this kumbaya, holding hands, we're all going to sit around the table and agree with each other environment. But how is that fundamentally possible when half the people at the table have no democratic accountability to anybody? Māori these representatives aren't being elected by Māori, they're being appointed. And we're just going to end up with whoever's got the loudest voice sitting around the table. And those who have good things to say won't ever be heard because there's no democratic process for them to be heard. But worst of all, there's no framework under which they can be held accountable and kicked out if they fail to deliver. There's none.
Well, we've seen this happen everywhere around the world that has engaged in ethno-separatism. And that's really the only word that we can really call it. We're separating society and preferring one race over another. And nowhere in the world has that ever ended well. It always ends in tears.
Exactly. There's nowhere in the world that you can show that it has worked. I mean, even Obama made a speech about the danger of tribalism as a form of government. I mean, it's everywhere, has been criticised as ineffective, and this and to suggest that just because I claim Māori ancestry that I'm beyond reproach and I can never do anything wrong and I will always act in the best interest of my people is just so flawed. And the danger to our democracy, first and foremost, it cannot be overstated. This is the most dangerous path we can go on. And the biggest losers, as Winston said on Sunday, the biggest losers will be Māori. The most in need, the most vulnerable Māori will be the ones that all of these who claim to represent Māori, they will stand on the backs of them to keep them down in order to maintain their relevance and authority where they don't deserve it.
Well, just touching on one of your comments there about this hand-wringing that goes on, we're seeing with the Kiri Allen debacle, the metaphoric and actual car crash of her career. And there's an article in Stuff on Tuesday morning that said that, just one moment, here it is. My message to Maori: we're allowed to be collectively and individually imperfect. And it's talking about how, poor Kiri Allen, the problem is she's a wahine Maori and just basically excuse making. And there seems to be this willingness in the media and in commentary amongst politicians as well to demean Maori and create a victim mentality, presumably so they can fix something. But they're looking at Kiri Allen's appalling behaviour, her drunkenness, her aggression, everything that's associated with her, and then saying, she's a poor, hard done by wahine Maori, and if you speak up against it, then you're a racist.
And they tried that argument with the Minister of Local Government, Nanaia Mahuta, when she was being attacked for appalling policy, appalling legislation. And she claimed a victim narrative on the basis that, these attacks have been racist. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with race. It would have been whatever minister held that portfolio who produced that piece of legislation should be vilified for it. And if we want to be taken seriously and being given credit and being accepted as an equal in this world, then you have to take the good with the bad. You can't take all the spoils and none of the cost. And that's, if you want a seat at the table, then you put your big boy pants on and you carry on with your job.
But isn't the key to having a seat at the table is putting up an idea, putting yourself out there, and then getting elected?
Mm-hmm.
But there seems to be this attitude that Maori don't need to be elected to anything, that they have this inherent right that's not even in the Treaty of Waitangi. And at the same time, we've got the rest of society demeaning Maori and disabling them by using demeaning tones and saying, well, they're vulnerable, they're this, they're that, and everything else. When in reality, in New Zealand, we have an equality, supposedly an equality of opportunity, but not necessarily an equality of outcome, which you can never have anyway.
And that's exactly right. That this argument that I've had since I first started challenging this issue was the narrative is that being Māori says you're predisposed to failure. I mean, what an appalling message to send to our young people, that we expect less of you, that we know that you're going to achieve less, so we're going to lower the standards and change the expectations. One of the most appalling narratives I listened to was when they were debating in the House the Canterbury Regional Council Ngāi Tahu Representation Bill, which was our first step to destroying our democracy, unelected representation forever on the Canterbury Regional Council. And I listened to the debate on the third reading, and it was Māori MP after Māori MP after Māori MP campaigning for and supporting the legislation on the narrative that democracy had failed Māori. Here were successful individual Māori MPs
in Parliament.
Where 26% of the MPs are Māori currently, and they're claiming that democracy has failed Māori. My argument is that Māori have failed Māori. The democratically elected MPs have failed Māori by contributing to this narrative, and they have the luxury of blaming everyone else for their failures by saying it's the system, it's this. So they don't have to actually produce any positive outcomes, because no matter how badly they do, they can continue to blame a system.
Is this what's driving you to join New Zealand First and stand for Parliament so that you can actually challenge that narrative directly to those disabling Maori elite that are currently in the House?
Absolutely. I mean, I've spent so many years when I was in the Police Association and through Hobson's Pledge and all of these organisations where I've tried to affect change by lobbying for logic and reason. And I've just reached the point where, you know, you've got to put your money where your mouth is and stand for it. And one of the things I've admired the most about Winston is that he has never once played this card of I'm Māori, therefore I speak for all Māori. He has always said he speaks for New Zealanders and demands better outcomes for New Zealanders. And that's what we need more than anything else. And, 30 years in politics, that you've got to give him some credit when all of these, run out of fuel in the tank stuff that's going on. 30 years and he's still up for the fight. And
it's more than 30 years. I can remember him standing in my parents' lounge when I was just a nipper, and I'm 54 now. So it's more like 40 years or more.
Yeah. And that's the point. I suppose it's 30 years of New Zealand First. And unwaveringly, that's what he stood for. And the conference on the weekend, one of the things that connected with me the most was the number of Māori who I felt like I'd come home, the number of Māori who were sitting there agreeing and going, yeah, this is not fair, this is not right, they don't speak for me, this isn't right, I'm not a victim, all of those sort of things that I've been saying. And to me it just energised me that this is where I belong.
You've belonged to and held senior positions in other political parties, haven't you?
So I did some work with New Conservative as a sort of a backroom sort of admin person, and I once did stand for ACT in 2011 because my brother, who was very political at the time, told me I had to put my name down on a list. So I was the candidate for Mangere. I think I got about 80 votes, but I don't think I actually drove into Mangere during that campaign.
But is it fair to say that you were politically homeless until recently? Very
much so. And I'd never sought being a candidate. I'd never considered being a candidate. And the more, it was actually a press release that Winston put out earlier in the year when he sort of said Winston's back, and that was to me that, I've got to listen to this, and I have listened, and I've read, and I've watched. There was one instance, and this is going back when National was in power, and New Zealand First offered 12 votes to National to get RMA reform, and at the time we were campaigning against National, or Hobson's Pledge were campaigning against National to stop their race-based policies. And New Zealand First offered 12 votes to National to get genuine RMA reform on the basis that race was removed out of the legislation or the amendments. And National turned it down and gave New Zealand iwi participation agreements. And anybody who's done any work with resource management knows what a quagmire of chaos that was. And National and New Zealand First showed that they were prepared for good outcomes to do whatever it needed, partner with whoever to get proper solutions. And to me, that was a real credit. And I think they've tested that they have really honest credentials on these issues.
That was under John Key's government. I knew the chief whip at the time, and he said to me at lunch the other day that was one of the best times he had dealt with Winston Peters was during that RMA reform. He was just appalled that John Key didn't take up that offer.
Mm.
And then if you look at John Key signing away the UNDRIP report and bringing that into society, that is the opening of the door that has led to this co-governance and the heroic rewriting of the treaty and assumptions that Queen Victoria, Empress of India, the ruler of the largest empire in the world, somehow signed a co-governance agreement with a whole bunch of disparate tribes that hated each other and were warring with each other, that didn't even have the wheel or ability to boil water or things like that on an equal footing with someone so powerful as that. It's farcical to even, when you say it out loud like that, but break it down into the most basic elements. It seems farcical that we've got political parties and elites in our society that are promulgating this idea of this partnership of equality when it wasn't like that at all.
And we're now harping back to wishing for the days when they just wanted equality, because now we're having members of the press, MPs saying that actually it was Article 3 promised equity. We've now moved even further. We're now supposed to be delivering equitable outcomes. I mean, the distortion. And what's lost in all this is we have a really impressive history. Sir Ranganatha talked about what an amazing document the treaty was.
How we won people.
And how we were so lucky, and nowhere in the world did he believe a native people had been treated so well. And that's nearly 100 years ago, Sir Ranganatha was saying that. And now we're looking back on our history like it's something to be ashamed of and it's something hideous. Of course, not everything went perfectly, but it was something that helped us form a nation. And that nation's been formed as a result of that treaty. And going back to who said what and when and what was intended and what was meant is irrelevant to who we are as a nation now. And trying to wind back the clock, all we're doing is just losing everybody's opportunity to succeed because we're just turning ourselves in knots.
Well, News Hub described you as the spokesperson for a fringe organizer or lobby group, a fringe lobby group. Hobson's Pledge was a fringe lobby group. And the things that we've been talking about now go right back to the foundation of New Zealand as a country. How many people are members of or subscribe to Hobson's Pledge in terms of, just to give it a size? So
the list currently is about 160,000 on our supporter list. So
well, that's enough to elect a political party to Parliament. Yep. That's enough votes to get you over 5%. It's hardly fringe.
Exactly. That's what I would have thought. But I'll tell you a background story. When we first formed Hobson's Pledge and we sent out and this is back in 2016, we sent out a press release, and Don Brash and I were the spokespeople, but the first press release we sent out to all the media outlets was only had my contact details, only had my phone number, my name. Don wasn't mentioned in it at all.
Yeah.
And not one media contacted me, but several media outlets tracked down every trustee that was named on our website that was male and not Māori. So they went after everybody that was, so I was totally ignored. And basically I've been ignored on the basis that you can't argue with me, it's hard to vilify me, although they do try. But that was the angle that they took right from when we set up, was that we were going to destroy the argument of arguing for equality before the law and make it racist and make it. And John Key was the first one to condemn us. John Key was the first one that he was Prime Minister at the time, came out and mocked Don and said, we've moved past this as a country. That was John Key's comment towards demanding equality before the law. And as you say, that was the government that signed up to UNDRIP. That was the government that gave us the Marine and Coastal Area Act. That was the government that first started the water discussions with the iwi Chairs Forum. This is the stuff that, and now every single centimetre of our coastline is under some sort of claim under the Marine and Coastal Area Act. So, yeah.
And now we've got three waters. And what a lot of people don't understand too is that the three waters idea didn't come out of thin air. That was being investigated and driven by the National Party before they lost power. And exactly. I know that's the case because I know the helicopter pilot that was flying John Key and Jerry Brownlee and a number of other people around surveying the North Island rivers, etc. And he said to me, "You cannot believe what was said in that over the headsets on that flight." And you can blame the Labor Party for really pushing ahead with the three waters and the co-governance and all of those ideas, but it was birthed inside the National Party. And if people are going to vote National to get rid of Labor, then all they're doing is turning a coin over, and National's the heads and Labor's the tails on that same coin. And this constant flip-flopping between red and blue teams and just changing the shirts hasn't done well for New Zealand for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's insanity to think it's going to change anything by doing that again in this election. And is that your gut feel as well, that you can't contemplate being a member of the Labor Party or the National Party because of that? And so you're looking for someone who's actually saying, I want to put New Zealand first and foremost before any other country or any other ideas.
And that's exactly the point, that we, if we don't have some strength that's going to pull policy and legislation back into the centre and back to respecting New Zealanders equal in their citizenship, regardless of their ancestry or ethnicity, we're doomed. And I make no bones about that. National have, as you say, an appalling record on this issue, and they're dancing on the head of a pin when they say that, we say no to co-governance of public services. What does that mean? That is just evasion. That is just absolute evasion. Water is not a public service, it's a natural resource. If they're advocating that we don't support co-governance of public services, but we're okay with natural resources, then what's the answer? That water is a natural resource, so therefore they are being evasive. On the same thing, on one hand, they say that the Māori Health Authority will go under a national government, and their health spokesperson, who I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Shane Reti, he's emailed us and confirmed that he is going to introduce compulsory cultural competency training for every single person working in the health sector.
But how does that mean? But exactly, what does it mean? I was born in Fiji. I'm a Fijian. I might not look it. I might look like the average white person, but I can't be called a Kaivalangi in Fiji. Right? Kaivalangi means foreigner, not born here, basically. But I was born there, so I'm a Kaiviti. So if I go into the hospital system in New Zealand and the Filipino nurses are now treating me and have to be culturally, how are they going to do that? What does this culture, are they going to account for all cultures, or is it just Maori culture that this awareness is being done for? And if that's the case, isn't that more condescension in treating Maori differently when they tip up at a hospital, when we're all human beings and our physiology and our makeup and our DNA is all pretty much the same, from a medical point of view?
And this argument that we keep hearing time and time again, this idea that systemic racism and institutional racism and stuff like that. If that actually was true, if that was right, why are not our courts bogged down by claims of racist conduct and breaches of the human rights and stuff like that? If that was actually true. Now, I have cared for my elders throughout my life in hospital, and Māori and non-Māori that I've been sat next to in hospital, and I have never encountered anything but care and consideration and kindness. Yeah, there's a lack of resourcing, there's frustration through lack of facilities, but to suggest that anybody is deliberately being racially insensitive is just an affront to the poor people that are trying to keep New Zealand healthy.
There's always the exception of these, there's always a rude person out there that's just a cantankerous, grumpy person that does things. They're an exception. Most Kiwis, and I've been critical of this in the past, most Kiwis go along to get along.
Yeah.
Right? We don't want to have this antagonism, this rewriting of history, this somehow it reminds me constantly now when we see it in the paper, we're told, or in the news, we're told about how colonialism was evil and the British haven't done anything. And it just reminds me of Monty Python's famous sketch, what have the Romans ever done for us? And my God, they were social commentators, 30, 40 years ahead of their time, because all of those things that they were mocking back then, we're hearing those same arguments. We see Rawiri Waititi ranting on TikTok about colonial governments and the thieving crown gang that had stolen his country. This, we see it on Facebook. We see it everywhere. There's this undercurrent of nasty racism that's actually coming from a vocal minority. Actually, they're the fringe people, and the majority of us aren't fringe at all. We just want to go along to get along, and we just get sick of all this nonsense. And
also the narrative that they are purporting is an insult to my ancestry. I descend from Patuani and Tamati Wakanini. Now, if anybody knows their history and what they did, to suggest that they were somehow, ignorant natives who signed up to something that they had no idea they were signing it is an insult. They were businessmen, they were academics, they were peacemakers, they were, that their history is astounding. And they signed the treaty fully informed. They were two of the chiefs that wrote to the Crown prior to the treaty in the 1830s, asking for protection from the Crown against the French. This is the history that they are just totally ignoring. And, I'm not suggesting you wipe out the good with the bad, but there is some really amazing stuff in our history and some amazing leaders and some incredible stories of, success and triumph and capability. And the likes of Rawiri Waititi, who is the type of person that I rail against the most. How dare you? How dare you say stuff about our history like we were, victims of something? Yes, bad stuff happened and we've had a process of redress, but don't continue to rob our young people of their opportunity to succeed and their belief in their own inherent capability by saying that, we're somehow incapable of doing it on our own.
But aren't we robbing our children's future with the dumbing down of the education system, the rewriting of history, the promulgation of this colonialism as evil, and then even expanding that now into destroying maths and science with some sort of fanciful idea that that Maori science, for want of a better term, supersedes actual science.
Yeah, and that's and you see that all around the world. This idea of academia is being shifted into a woke sort of environment of just virtue signalling and nonsense. We've lost the ability to think critically and intelligently and come up with solutions. And this government has just bought into that narrative to such an extent that it's been accelerated. How can you possibly be tweaking with nonsense when half of our kids aren't going to school routinely. I mean, it's just
more than
bizarre.
More than half aren't going to school, When you've got an education minister who triumphs, announces that it's amazing, it's wonderful. We had 62% of our children attend school last term.
Yeah. And the failure to engage with the people who, New Zealand Initiative with Professor Elizabeth Rata produced an amazing, report on education and real solutions. And we just don't use the skills and capability and knowledge we've got. We just go off on tangents and reinvent nonsense.
I remember Elizabeth Rata well. She was brought on to a show on Maori TV to attack me, and the two of us ended up agreeing pretty much in the thing, much to the astonishment of Willie Jackson, who was sitting there trying to moderate it all, and
that's the point, that I think the biggest difficulty we have is if we can't sit in a room and talk logically and sensibly about what the issues are, what is our common ground, what are we hoping to achieve, and there isn't a single person or politician, whatever your political views, that doesn't want better outcomes. So, and that's where I see the strength of New Zealand First. The ability to cross the room to achieve a good outcome is essential, and it will be essential going into government. And as you say, red or blue, you have to have parties that have the experience and expertise to get things over the line. And I use this quote a bit with Thomas Sowell talks about politics. There's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And you have to be good at it. You have to know how to trade off in order to keep moving forward. And that's the skill that I think that we need now more than ever.
That's the thing that I've been trying to achieve over the last few years, particularly since I had my stroke and the recovery of that. But I was deeply enmeshed and embedded in polarization and party polarization. Everyone's still today, I get trolls attacking me on Twitter and Facebook and saying, "Oh, you're just a National Party spokesperson." And I learned a lesson from all of that, and I've slowed myself down, but I've learned a lesson that if we foster polarization and segregation and division, then why would we be surprised when polarization and segregation and division occurs within society? And somehow, I don't know if there's anybody you can blame on this, but I can put. It used to be a right-left argument. It used to be a Tories versus progressives argument. It used to be, Helen Clark was huge on that. She was very polarizing. I admire her immensely for her skills, her management skills, her political skills. But I don't admire the division that she sowed into society back then, And the National Party was just as bad. We had Jim Bolger and people like that, doing that, and Jenny Shipley to a certain extent. But I've found that talking to people of all political persuasions, and I'm willing to talk to all people, across the platform. I'll talk to anybody.
Yeah.
And moving into media, out of politics and into media now, I'm trying to do that. But these people have written this history about me, for example, that says that I'm this awful person that you can't talk to, and therefore foster that division and that polarization. And that's how I've actually come to spend a fair bit of time talking off the record with people like Shane Jones and Winston Peters and some Labour politicians, actually, and a couple of Greens, because they respect the ideas that people have. They might not agree with them, but they might see a way that those ideas could be molded, perhaps, or even.
Yep, exactly.
I think Winston said to me one day over a whiskey and a cigar, "Cam, you can't change an immovable object, right? It's easier to get the ball rolling and then change the direction of something getting rolling." And that was a really wise thing, and I picked up on that And it frustrates the hell out of me that we've just lost the ability in New Zealand to, and you were talking about that, have these discussions without getting upset about things and work out where is the common ground. And I've had the same thing with Chris Trotter. You know, he and I agree on more things than we disagree on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definite shifting there, yeah.
Right? So if Chris Trotter and I agree on more things than we disagree on, and you and I agree on more things than we disagree on, shouldn't we focus on what we agree on, not what we disagree on?
Yep. And that's exactly the point. We have lost the ability to find the common ground, but we've also lost the ability to argue and debate. I mean, I grew up in a household, Dad was a journalist. We argued. Dad would argue one side of the story one day and the next side of the story the next day, just in order to have an argument. Loved an argument. But nobody ever went away. You know, I didn't, find him an abominable person because he disagreed with me or he was arguing against me or anything like that. You have the ability to really, and I remember having a debate on an issue once, and it was with my brother, and he finally said, well, I'm glad I had that discussion because now I know I'm not a bigot because I did change my mind. And that's that, we have to learn and we have to come from different scenarios. And I find it really difficult. Like I've had lots of instances, Māori TV programs quite often would invite me on because they needed someone to be the whipping post, someone to be the yin to the yang sort of thing. And I'd sit in the green room listening to these representatives of Māori, highly successful individuals, talking about how well they were doing. They sold their house and moved to the grammar zone so their kids could go to grammar schools in Auckland and, their property on White, just all of this stuff. But in front of the camera, they would look into the lens and say, it's so hard for Māori. And I thought, why aren't you telling your story? Why aren't you telling young Māori that you can do this too? This is what we've done. Don't look in the camera and tell them that you're predetermined for failure. Tell them that you have the opportunity to succeed. And that's the stuff that got me angry was this, how dare you rob them of their potential by pushing that narrative in order to make yourselves relevant and successful.
Well, it's a narrative that I call it disabling. And, people make assumptions. They look at me and they say, oh, well, you're a European. You've been brought up with a silver spoon in your mouth and your dad was a wealthy businessman. But they don't actually understand people's backgrounds. They haven't bothered to talk and learn their backgrounds. If they had, they'd know that my father was brought up in poverty in a state house in a hard hat area of Auckland with a split family. His father had walked out on them, emptied the house completely. He used to work at the butcher shop for meat rather than wages so that the family had meat. And he learnt the value of an education and hard work by having to do that to get ahead. And even then it got worse. He got kicked out of the house and was brought up by his grandmother and his grandfather, which then formed another part. Right. So this is a story that he could use to say he's had a terrible upbringing and as a result, he's a terrible father. But he doesn't. He did the best that he could with the resources that he had. Even his father even wouldn't let him go to the 7th form. He said, no, you can go out and work. So that was the end of him wanting to be a lawyer. He then had to become an accountant because he was limited by choices other people made. And this is I see this all the time. We're seeing this with the Kiri Allen situation where we've got these elite people who have done well for themselves, tutting about how terrible it is that Kiri Allen, a Wahine Maori, is so hard done by. And, she needs some there's some pats on the back and a few hugs and it's okay. But if there's anybody else who'd done what she's done, they'd be out there asking for their throat to be cut. And it's just ridiculous to see this. But apparently we're the ones that have got fringe views,
Well, we had that recently when a certain Labour MP, put out her tweeted her announcement that, now her father wouldn't have to choose between prescriptions and heating the house, neglecting the fact
he was living in her house.
Yeah, and that she's a St. Cuss educated and he's a knight, and just
drives a Jaguar, and they have a swimming pool. This was not an impoverished person that couldn't afford a $5 part charge for a prescription. This was a fanciful idea put out there for virtue signaling, and the media all lapped it up until I came along.
And then there's no consequence to it. There's no, following up on it. I did a submission. It's the Māori Affairs Committee called for submissions on the renaming of New Zealand to Aotearoa as a result of the Māori Party petition that was at the beginning of this year. And, of course, I was opposing the distortion of our history and calling New Zealand Aotearoa. But that's the ultimate in cultural appropriation. I mean, it's so funny. It's not. I mean, it was a name dreamed up by a European writing a book. Yeah, and it was a poetical sort of. Anyway, I was challenged specifically by Rarui Waititi again, but one of the questions I thought was the most telling, because I was just arguing about our history. Like, this is not our, this was never the name of New Zealand. It was never, you can choose to call it whatever you like. If you want to do that, you want to change the name, that's fine. But don't say it's because it was the original name of our country. And the first question he asked me was, are you Māori? And I thought, what has that got to do with it? There was nothing to do with it. Why would that change my ability to speak or not to speak on the issue? Concerningly, the select committee still hasn't reported back, so I'm worried about what they're sitting on that. But this idea that if you say it often enough, it becomes truth. So therefore, they've said it often enough, so it is the traditional name of our country, despite there being no historical record of it at all being the name that Māori used for New Zealand. And then all of the bleeding heart liberals, as Winston always calls them, come along and nod and wring their hands and go, yes, we've stolen your nation's name. It's just such a distortion.
But that's the distortion that led us to UNDRIP, because I know that John Key signed up to UNDRIP because he had this belief that there were no Indigenous people of New Zealand, because Maori's own oral history says that they were the first colonizers. And I like to say that to Wairu Waititi. I like to say, well, you're the first colonizers. Your oral history tells us that you came from somewhere else and came to New Zealand. So therefore, you aren't Indigenous. You're Indigenous somewhere else. You're the first colonizers. And that's an inconvenient truth that they don't want to acknowledge, because if they do acknowledge that, even though they still keep telling us about how fantastic Maori were as navigators, that they sailed here and they arrived here in great canoes, and it's a wonderful story. It's not unlike the story of the Viking explorers going to Iceland and then to Greenland and then to North America, right? It's a similar story. It's fantastic. But it doesn't mean you're Indigenous.
And it's also become a distraction, because what does it matter? The fact is we have formed a nation, and we formed a pretty incredible nation. And
we're all from somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's the Martin Luther King saying, we may have come here all in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. We have to, and that's what I always go back to Saraparanganata, we have to look forward so that we can walk shoulder to shoulder together to a better future. And we're not doing that. We're so busy checking behind us and looking backwards as if there was something better back there that we don't have now. And while we keep doing that, and while we refuse to allow ourselves to look forward and look for better solutions, we're not going to find it. And it was really interesting at the conference. Catherine Rich, who's now CEO of Age Concern, gave a really impressive speech about, there's not just Māori suffering in this country, and really tragic stories of aged care, of children, a whole range of things. But she reminded me of a quote, and she used it, the quote about from Winston Churchill, and it was it's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes we have to do what is required. And and we have a government now that they actually think, I'm doing our best, and we're doing our best, and we're doing our best, and that is not enough. I don't care how much. If you were running a business and you kept going on about how you're doing your best and you were losing money every day, then at that point you go, well, that doesn't mean anything. You can work as hard as you like. If you're still going backwards, if you're still failing to deliver a product and still unable to produce anything, doing your best means nothing. And that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Well, that's really the hallmark of the Ardern-Hipkins regime, isn't it? They started off with let's do this, but no definition of what this was. I mean, we had a couple of flagship policies, Kiwi Build, and it turned out that Labor couldn't build a house in a room full of Lego. And then they said we're going to plant 1 billion trees. Well, have we heard where we're at with that? I suspect it's several 100 million short of 1 billion trees. And light rail to the airport. Well, they haven't even laid a millimetre of track. They've had a couple of goes and several $100 million of planning, but not even laid them. Then we had we'll build a bridge across the harbour. Well, where's that? So all of these flagship policies that we all signed up for let's do this, turned into not yet, or change the name, or let's just not talk about that. And then we had a year of delivery that delivered nothing. Then we had the year of the vaccine, which has caused all sorts of divisions in society as well as a result of that. And then when it all got too hard, her dibs sloughed off to greener pastures, leaving a complete disaster for Chris Hipkins. And we're seeing that unfold now with the train wreck or car crash of Kiri Allen's career and Stuart Nash and all the rest of the mess that was left really behind by Ardern. And these people are begging for another go.
Yeah, and that's how insulting it is to those individuals that are running businesses and working 90 hours a week and not drawing a salary off their business because they're trying so hard to keep things afloat. That haven't had a day off in 3 years because they're trying to keep their businesses afloat. Anybody who's run a business, and I've been in that position where you pay
yourself last.
You pay yourself last. You don't sleep all of the weekend because you're not sure if you're going to have enough money for payroll on Monday. Those are the things that they just have no concept of. And I couldn't imagine how confronting that would be to have, someone, stare down the camera and say, oh, look, I'm tired.
I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best, but I'm tired. There's nothing left in the tank. I can write a book, but I can't run the country. It's rubbish. But I mean, you look at housing, for example, there's nothing more key for society than having its population well housed. And the vast majority of housing in New Zealand is provided by private landlords. It's not by the state. It's by private landlords. So what does this government do? They vilify and attack landlords. Mm-hmm. They heap costs onto landlords and then express utter surprise that rents have gone sky high and continue to climb. I mean, if you go and load up costs onto landlords, and whether it's tax impositions by saying, well, you can't depreciate this anymore, or you can't have tax deductibility. Well, if they can't do that, and it doesn't make business sense to do that, the only place that the landlord has got to make it work for them financially is to increase rents. Mm. If you say, right, we're going to pass a healthy homes, it's an admirable policy. It really is. Insulation, it's all good. But if you don't marry that up with education, that you still need to open your windows, you still need to do these things, and at the same time, you've got a cost of living crisis, which is putting power prices up. You've got all of these, tens of thousands of dollars for landlords to put all the heating in. They're going to recover that from the only place they can, which is the tenants.
Yeah.
And then that exacerbates the cost of living. And these these lunatics that are in charge, Grant Robertson, I don't think he would know the left from the right of a profit and loss statement. They're sitting there absolutely baffled that these things have happened.
Yep.
And, we need to actually say, look, enough, right? You're too stupid to be in charge. Go away for, I don't know, a generation. That'd be nice. Go away and learn how an economy actually works.
And have some respect for the people on which we rely on to keep this country going. When you're telling, anybody who's got a bit of money or built up some assets, you're the bad guy and you're the reason why they're poor. I mean, what an appalling message to send to divide a nation. Like, it's just tragic. And those are the concerns I have about, if the biggest thing about the housing shortage was the cost of land was a massive issue. Everyone knew that you need to release land. Everyone knew you need to make resource management easier, simpler, quicker. And so what do we do? What have we created? A co-governance quagmire that is just unworkable. And no matter how you look at it, nobody could make it work. But they're pushing ahead. And it's just, and on every aspect that they've touched, it's been like the opposite of the Midas touch. It's just turned everything to dead weight stone, unable to produce anything. And I just, it's hard not to go. I mean, I can't claim to be an expert and I can't claim to be knowledgeable, but the one thing that, we need is practical people that are prepared to dig around and find the answers and not accept because some bureaucrat came in and told me this is the situation. If you don't have the capability and nous to get to the truth and find out what the heck's going on and find the answers and talk to the right people, we're never going to fix anything. Yeah. And I remember in the police association, we always used to joke about the fact that the first term police minister was great because they wanted to do stuff because they could blame everything wrong on the second, the previous government. Yeah. The second term minister wanted plausible deniability, so didn't really want to know anything, just, but don't get me in trouble. And the third term was just tell me nothing, like just I don't want to know anything. Don't, The
Sergeant Schultz minister.
Yeah, exactly.
I know nothing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think, the Labor has accelerated. They're taking the third term approach in the second term, and they're just distancing themselves from everything.
I think they're just inept. And we've got an ineptocracy of stupid people doing stupid things. And we need to say enough. And, we need to actually literally change. When I say change the government, I mean, I don't mean just swap teams. Yeah. I mean, we need to have people that are saying, no, that's a dumb idea. No. Everyone mocks Winston for being a handbrake. But every car has one. No, every car has a handbrake. Why is that?
That's the testament too, is that when you bring more and more bureaucrats into a struggling business, if you're running a business and it's not going well, you streamline. You get rid of all of the surplus, the marketing people and the HR consultants and the
get rid of HR.
Yeah, and you streamline. You work out. The receptionist gets sacked. You work through so that you can see every aspect of your business. Yeah, and know exactly what is going on. And you don't trust that somebody told me they did something. You actually make sure they did it. Yeah, and that's and I can't see there's any difference whether you're running a country, a household, or a business. You have to know. You have to directly know and be brave enough to ask the right questions. And that's what I think, Winston has the credentials where he has always challenged the topics and sought the right answers and taken cost to do it. And I think that's what desperately what we need.
Well, I've talked to you for about an hour now. And the key theme that I'm picking up through all of this for you is that you want to bring accountability back to government.
Yeah, I really do. And that's the one thing, when you leave the police, you don't think you know anything. You just, I've got no university qualifications. I was a South Auckland cop. I became a detective. I became a detective sergeant. And what I found after going into the private sector and working was that one skill you have is that you have the ability to find answers, to challenge people, get the truth out of people, and to understand people and know where they're coming from. And I think desperately we need to cut through a whole lot of the smoke screens and mirrors. And I don't think anybody does it better than New Zealand First, really.
Well, I look forward to seeing you on the front bench of New Zealand First and holding everybody's feet to the fire when you're in there.
Thanks very much, Cameron. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming on The Crunch with me this afternoon. And I wish you all the best for the election campaign.
Thanks very much.
Wow, what a bright and refreshing candidate Casey is. She's driven to improve the outcomes of all Kiwis and shared that with us. And she believes her best chance of doing that lies with New Zealand First. And she shared also that she has an enormous respect for Winston Peters.
This is The Crunch with Cam Slater. Conversations with a side of controversy, right here on RCR.